A routine protest turns violent when police shatter a CEO's arm with a baton. Was it justified? Or an abuse of power? The footage will make you question everything. Ethan Graves had spent years building Novacorp into one of the most powerful defense contractors in the world. He was respected in the corporate world but feared by those who saw him as an obstacle to their plans. For years, whispers had surrounded his company. Some called him a necessary force in national security, while others claimed he was too close to the government. On the night of his arrest, Ethan had just finished a private business meeting at an upscale restaurant. The meeting had been tense, filled with veiled warnings from investors who seemed uneasy about the path Novacorp was taking. He had barely stepped outside when uniformed officers blocked his way. "Mr. Graves, we need you to come with us," one of them said, his voice firm but devoid of emotion. Ethan frowned. "What is this about?" "We just need to ask a few questions about an ongoing investigation," the officer replied. Ethan hesitated. Something was off. He had dealt with government inquiries before. There were protocols, formal summons, meetings with lawyers. This was different. The officer's eyes held no room for discussion. "If you need to question me, I'd prefer to do it at my lawyer's office." That was when their demeanor shifted. One officer stepped forward and grabbed Ethan's arm, twisting it behind his back with sudden force. "You're resisting," the officer said sharply. "What? Let go of me." Ethan struggled, his instincts kicking in. He was no stranger to pressure, but this was not an arrest, it was an ambush. He tried to pull away, but before he could say another word, a baton came down hard against his forearm. The sharp crack of breaking bone echoed through the street. Ethan collapsed, screaming in agony. Bystanders gasped, some reaching for their phones to record the scene. Blood pounded in his ears as pain shot through his body. He barely registered the officers dragging him towards a police vehicle, his vision blurring from the pain. Within hours, the footage spread across social media, igniting a wave of outrage. News anchors debated whether this was a case of excessive force or something more sinister. "This is a clear case of police brutality," one commentator argued. "A man like Ethan Graves, wealthy, influential, being treated this way? What does that say about justice in this country?" Others were more skeptical. "There's something bigger here. You don't just arrest a CEO like this without a reason. What was he involved in?" The police department released a brief statement, claiming Ethan had resisted arrest. But the video told a different story. Protesters gathered outside the hospital where he was being treated, demanding answers. But behind the public uproar, powerful figures were already working to bury the truth. Novacorp had been under scrutiny for months. Leaked reports hinted at secret dealings with the government. Some whispered that Ethan had been getting too close to classified information, something that certain people wanted to keep hidden at any cost. Lying in a hospital bed with his arm in a cast, Ethan tried to make sense of what had happened. There had been no warrant, no formal charges, just brute force. His legal team faced roadblocks at every turn. Police records were mysteriously sealed, and witnesses who had spoken out on social media began deleting their posts. Someone was erasing the evidence. The only person he could trust was Mark Connolly, a fearless investigative journalist. Mark had spent years exposing government corruption, and when he visited Ethan at the hospital, he brought more than just concern. He had a message from an anonymous source. "This was no accident," Mark read from an email. "Novacorp has enemies in high places." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Someone planned this. But why? What are they trying to hide?" Mark's eyes were sharp. "That's what we need to find out." The pieces weren't adding up. If Ethan was truly guilty of something, why were certain groups working so hard to silence the story? The case against the officers seemed to be disappearing overnight. And then, just as suddenly as Ethan had been arrested, all charges against him were dropped.
No explanation.
No press conference. It was as if someone had pulled strings from the shadows, ensuring that Ethan's case was wiped from public record. Mark paced the hospital room. "This doesn't make sense. They brutalized you in public, then erased it like it never happened. Whoever is behind this has serious power." Ethan's jaw clenched. He had spent years navigating corporate warfare, but this was something else. This was an attack from forces that didn't care about business, they cared about control. Then, a sudden revelation struck him. The meeting he had before his arrest, the warnings from his investors. They knew, Ethan murmured. They warned me something was coming. They just didn't say what. Mark's eyes narrowed. You think someone inside NovaCorp set you up? Ethan thought about it. He had always been careful about who he trusted, but NovaCorp was filled with people who had their own ambitions. Someone had orchestrated this. Someone had wanted him out of the way. Just then, Mark's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his face darkened. You're not going to believe this. He turned the screen towards Ethan. It was a newly leaked document from an inside source. Ethan read the words carefully, his pulse quickening. It's a classified government contract, Mark explained. One NovaCorp was about to expose. It's proof that billions of taxpayer dollars are being funneled into black ops projects. Projects that don't officially exist. Ethan's stomach sank. This wasn't just corporate corruption. This was something far more dangerous. And now he was at the center of it. Determined to find the truth, Mark Connolly buried himself in NovaCorp's financial records, classified contracts, and internal communications. He had seen corruption before, but this was something far more dangerous. Ethan Graves had uncovered billions of dollars in fraudulent deals between the government and private defense firms. Money was being funneled into secret projects, projects that didn't exist on paper. If Ethan had planned to expose them, it was clear why he had been silenced. This isn't just fraud, Mark muttered, staring at his screen. This is something else. Ethan, now recovering under tight security, was coming to his own conclusions. The brutality of his arrest wasn't just an intimidation tactic. It was a warning. He was certain someone in NovaCorp had betrayed him. As he sifted through confidential files, one name kept appearing: Harlan Voss, NovaCorp's head of government operations. Voss, Ethan whispered, narrowing his eyes. Why would he turn on me? Voss had always been ambitious, but Ethan had trusted him. Now patterns began to emerge. Voss had been moving funds, shifting resources, and making backdoor deals. Ethan had no solid proof, but instinct told him that Voss was working against him. The question was, who was he working with? Meanwhile, Mark received a tip from a hidden source. A NovaCorp employee using the alias Echo reached out with information too dangerous to ignore. They arranged a meeting at an underground parking lot, far from cameras and prying eyes. When Mark arrived, Echo was already waiting, a hood pulled low over their face. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Echo whispered, handing over an encrypted drive. They're watching everyone. Journalists, politicians, even their own people. Mark plugged the drive into his laptop later that night and felt his stomach drop. The files revealed something far worse than corporate fraud. NovaCorp had been running illegal surveillance programs, monitoring high-ranking officials and journalists. They weren't just stealing money. They were controlling information. But before Mark could publish anything, Echo disappeared. Mark tried calling, but the number was disconnected. When he went to Echo's apartment, he found the door wide open. Inside, the place was wrecked, papers shredded, furniture overturned, hard drives smashed. It was as if Echo had never existed. A chill ran down Mark's spine. Someone was erasing the evidence. The next morning, Mark's phone buzzed with a blocked number. He hesitated, then answered. Stop digging, a distorted voice warned. You're in over your head. Mark clenched his jaw. Who are you? The line went dead. He knew he had to move fast. He arranged a secret meeting with Ethan at an abandoned warehouse outside the city. Ethan arrived, his arm still in a cast, but his mind sharper than ever. Someone inside NovaCorp is helping them, Ethan said. I need to know who. Mark nodded. We have a bigger problem. This goes beyond NovaCorp. Someone in the government is involved. They're deleting everything, wiping out entire identities. Ethan exhaled sharply. Then we need to get ahead of them. Together, they traced a shell corporation that had been moving NovaCorp's illicit funds. The company was supposed to be independent, but deeper research revealed it was a front. And the name attached to it made Ethan's blood run cold. Harlan Voss. Mark turned his laptop toward Ethan. Voss is the key. He's the one linking Novacorp to government contracts. Ethan's hands curled into fists. Then we expose him. But before they could act, Mark noticed something strange. His laptop screen flickered, files disappearing before his eyes. A cyber attack. Someone was inside his system, erasing everything. Shut it down, Ethan shouted. Mark yanked the power cord, but it was too late. The drive was wiped clean. They had been tracked. A car screeched to a stop outside the warehouse. Mark and Ethan exchanged a look before bolting toward the back exit. As they ran, gunshots echoed behind them. Someone wanted them dead. They barely escaped, disappearing into the city's maze of alleys and backstreets. When they finally stopped to catch their breath, Ethan pulled out a second flash drive from his pocket. I made a copy, he said. Mark let out a breath of relief. Then we still have a chance. The chase was far from over. Their enemies had money, power, and resources, but now Mark and Ethan had something even more valuable. Proof. The only question was, how long could they survive before the people hunting them struck again? Mark knew he had to act fast. The files he had obtained were enough to bring down Novacorp and its powerful allies, but getting them to the public was proving to be a dangerous game. He had spent days gathering every last piece of evidence, ensuring that no stone was left unturned. But just as he prepared to release the information, danger struck. One evening, as he stepped out of his apartment, a black van screeched to a stop in front of him. Before he could react, 3 masked men rushed out, shoving him against the wall. Hand it over, one of them demanded, his voice low and threatening. They knew about the files. They knew about Echo. Mark hesitated, weighing his options. If they got their hands on his phone, it was all over. Without another thought, he threw it into the busy street. The device shattered under the tires of a passing car. The men cursed. One lunged at Mark, but he ducked and twisted out of their grasp. His heart pounded as he sprinted into the crowded city, weaving between pedestrians. He could hear them behind him, their footsteps quick and relentless. He turned sharply into an alleyway, scaling a fence just as they closed in. He didn't stop running until he was sure he had lost them. Out of breath and shaken, Mark knew one thing. He wasn't safe anymore. With no other option, he contacted Ethan, who had already gone into hiding. The two met in a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was a place Ethan had used before when he needed to work off the radar. They know everything, Mark said, pacing the room. Ethan sat in a chair, his injured arm still in a cast. Then we're out of time, he replied. We need to move now. Together, they pieced through the information Mark had gathered. Their breakthrough came when they traced a shell corporation that was supposedly an independent contractor for the government. But the deeper they looked, the clearer it became that it was just a front, a cover for illegal financial dealings that led straight to a high-ranking official. If we expose this, it won't just be Novacorp on the line, Mark said. Ethan nodded grimly. It'll bring down some of the most powerful people in the country. But before they could act, the tables turned. Overnight, news reports surfaced claiming that Mark Connolly was a fugitive. Accusations of hacking into federal databases spread like wildfire. He was now a wanted man. They're setting me up, Mark growled, staring at the television screen. They're trying to erase me. Ethan didn't hesitate. Then we erased them first. Forced to go completely off-grid, Mark abandoned everything. No phones, no credit cards, no digital trace. He and Ethan moved from one safe house to another, staying just ahead of those hunting them. They needed a plan, and fast. Their chance came in the form of an unexpected ally. A contact within the government reached out, someone deep inside the system who wanted the truth to come out. You don't have much time, the voice on the encrypted call warned. There's a meeting happening tomorrow. The people responsible for this cover-up will all be there. If you can get proof, it'll be undeniable. Ethan and Mark exchanged glances. It was a risk, but it was the break they needed. The following night, Mark infiltrated the building where the meeting was being held. Ethan, monitoring from a remote location, guided him through the security systems. "Stay low," Ethan murmured through the earpiece. Security cameras at the end of the hall. Mark moved swiftly, his heart hammering. He reached the conference room and activated a small recording device. Their conversation made his stomach turn. "We need to make sure Graves and Connolly disappear," one voice said. "The files have already been erased," another added. "But if they leak anything, it'll be a disaster. Then we eliminate them before they get the chance." Mark clenched his fists. This was it, the evidence they needed. He quietly retrieved the recording device and slipped out. But as he rounded a corner, he came face to face with a guard. "Hey! Stop!" Mark bolted. Alarms blared as security swarmed the building. He raced through the halls, bursting through an emergency exit just as gunfire erupted behind him. He hit the ground, rolling to safety before sprinting into the darkness. He barely made it back to Ethan, breathless and shaking. "Tell me you got it," Ethan said urgently. Mark held up the device. "We have them." They prepared to release the evidence, but just as they were about to upload the files, the power in their hideout cut out. The room plunged into darkness. "They found us," Ethan muttered. Mark and Ethan had been digging for weeks, and now, at last, they had something that could shake the foundations of power. A hidden recording, one that could expose everything. In the dim glow of their safe house, Mark played the audio again, his hands trembling. The voices were unmistakable. Top government officials, corporate executives, and military leaders all speaking freely in a secret meeting. "The public doesn't need to know how we allocate resources," one voice said, calm and assured. "If Graves keeps pushing, we have ways to handle him," another voice responded, more coldly. Then came the most chilling statement of all. "If we need to remove obstacles, we will. No loose ends." Mark turned to Ethan, whose face had gone pale. "They weren't just trying to ruin you. If you had kept going, they would have made sure you disappeared." Ethan clenched his fists. "Then we make sure they don't get the chance." They had to move fast. Mark contacted Dante Pierce, a rogue hacker who had been in hiding for years. Once an intelligence analyst, Dante had uncovered illegal military operations before being forced to disappear. Now, he was their only chance to get the truth out. "We released the files all at once," Dante explained over a secure channel. "No single news outlet, multiple sources at the same time. That way, they can't shut it down before people see it." The plan was set, but just as they were about to execute it, Ethan stepped outside for a breath of air. That was when everything fell apart. A black SUV screeched to a stop. Figures in dark suits moved fast. Ethan barely had time to react before he was shoved inside, the door slamming shut behind him. Minutes later, Mark's phone buzzed. A simple message: "Turn yourself in, or he dies." Mark's heart pounded. He knew this was a trap, but he also knew what would happen if he ignored it. He took a deep breath. There was no choice. Following the instructions, he found himself at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The air smelled of rust and oil. He stepped inside, only to be grabbed from behind. Within seconds, he was zip-tied and dragged deeper into the dark space. And then he saw him. Ethan was tied to a chair, his face bruised, his broken arm hanging uselessly at his side. Standing before him was a man Mark recognized all too well, Harlan Voss. Ethan's voice was weak but steady. You should have stayed in line, Ethan." Voss interrupted, smirking. "You had a good thing going. Powerful company. Wealth. But then you had to start asking questions. And that was a mistake." Mark's blood boiled. "So you set him up. The arrest, the beating, it was all you." Voss shrugged. "Had to discredit him. Make him look like a liability. The board was ready to replace him anyway. I just sped up the process." Ethan struggled against his restraints. "I trusted you." Voss leaned closer. "That was your first mistake." For a moment, Mark feared it was over. Voss had won. But then a sharp beep echoed from Ethan's pocket. A faint blue light blinked inside his jacket. Voss frowned. "What is that?" Ethan's lips curled into a weak smile. "That is your end." Miles away, In a secure server room, Dante watched as files began transmitting. A flash drive, hidden in Ethan's jacket, had just activated its failsafe. Every document, every recording, every piece of evidence was being sent to journalists, whistleblowers, and activists across the world. Voss's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his face drained of color.
No.
A siren blared outside. Voices shouted in the distance. The warehouse doors burst open as armed officers stormed in. But these weren't Voss's men. These were federal agents responding to a story that had just broken nationwide. Voss turned to Ethan, fury in his eyes. You planned this. Ethan managed a nod. No loose ends, right? Voss reached for his gun, but an agent tackled him to the ground before he could fire. Mark felt hands pulling him to his feet, cutting the zip ties from his wrists. The nightmare was over, or so he thought. As Voss was dragged away, Mark received a call. A disguised voice, low and careful. You think this is over? You've barely scratched the surface. Then the line went dead. Mark exchanged a glance with Ethan. They had won this battle, but a war was still waiting for them. And their enemies weren't done yet. The moment the files went public, the world exploded in outrage. News agencies broadcast the recordings nonstop. People flooded the streets in protest, demanding justice. Government officials who had been untouchable for years were suddenly being exposed. Within hours, high-ranking leaders began resigning, and corporate executives went into damage control mode. Investigations were launched, and the entire system shook under the weight of undeniable truth. Novacorp had been at the center of a massive conspiracy, but it was clear the corruption didn't end there. We did it, Mark whispered as he stared at the news reports on the screen. But the relief was short-lived. Ethan paced the room. His face was bruised, his arm still in a cast from his brutal arrest. Not everyone involved is going down. Some of them knew this was coming. Mark turned to him. What do you mean? They're disappearing, Ethan said. The ones with real power. The deeper we dig, the more we find that they've erased themselves. Someone has been covering their tracks long before we even started this. The truth was undeniable. While some officials and corporate leaders were falling, others had seen the storm coming and vanished. Files were being deleted from government servers, key witnesses were going missing, and those who had orchestrated the corruption at the highest levels were slipping away into the shadows. Then, something unexpected happened. An encrypted email appeared in Mark's inbox.
No sender.
No subject, just an attachment. Mark hesitated before opening it. Inside were documents detailing an even greater conspiracy, one that went deeper than Novacorp, deeper than the government contracts. There were names he had never seen before, hidden accounts linked to offshore banks, and most shocking of all, evidence that someone inside the government had known about the leaks before they happened. They're still watching us, Ethan muttered as he read over Mark's shoulder. Then Mark's phone rang. A disguised voice spoke, calm and cold. You're in over your head. The line went dead. Mark stared at his phone, his pulse racing. Whoever was behind this wasn't finished. They had seen what Mark and Ethan had done, and now they were warning them to stop. We have to disappear, Ethan said, grabbing his coat. Now. But Mark shook his head. No. If we stop now, they win. Ethan sighed. We're not journalists with a newspaper protecting us. We're targets. These people don't issue warnings unless they mean them. Before Mark could respond, the lights in their hideout flickered. A low hum filled the air, followed by the sound of tires screeching outside. Mark rushed to the window. 3 black SUVs had just pulled up, men in suits stepping out. They found us, he whispered. Ethan grabbed a bag filled with the evidence they had left. We need to go. Now. They burst out the back door just as the front was forced open. Running through the dark alley, they barely made it to Ethan's car before the gunfire started. Glass shattered as bullets ripped through the windows. Ethan swerved onto the main road, dodging traffic. Who are they? Mark shouted. Not police. Ethan gritted his teeth. They don't want us arrested. They want us gone. The chase lasted for miles. Ethan weaved through the streets, pushing the car to its limits. Just when it seemed they were losing their pursuers, a black helicopter appeared above them, its spotlight locking onto their vehicle. "They're not giving up," Ethan said. "We need to split up." Mark hesitated but nodded. At the next intersection, Ethan skidded to a stop. "Take the bag," he said, shoving the documents into Mark's hands. "Get to Dante." Dante Pierce, the rogue hacker who had helped them leak the files. He was the only one left who could help now. "What about you?" Mark asked. Ethan smirked. "I'll buy you time." Before Mark could argue, Ethan floored the gas, drawing their pursuers away. Mark ran. He moved through the shadows, avoiding cameras, keeping his head down. He made his way to a safe house, where Dante was waiting. "You brought trouble," Dante muttered as he let Mark in. Mark dropped the bag onto the table. "I have more files. Bigger than before." Dante's eyes widened as he scanned the documents. This isn't just corruption. This is war." The files revealed something far worse than they had imagined. A global network of corporations and government officials, manipulating entire economies. Wars had been started, leaders installed and removed, all controlled from the shadows. Novacorp was only a small part of a much bigger machine. "We have to go public with this," Mark said. Dante hesitated. "You don't understand. If you release this, you're not just exposing corruption. You're declaring war against people who have been controlling the world for decades." Mark took a deep breath. He had already made his decision. Before they could act, the door burst open. Armed men stormed in. Mark and Dante barely had time to react before they were dragged to the ground. A familiar voice spoke. "You should have walked away." Mark looked up. It was Harlan Voss, Ethan's former associate, the man who had orchestrated his downfall. He was still pulling the strings. "You think you can change the world?" Voss sneered. "You have no idea how deep this goes." Mark gritted his teeth. "People know the truth now." Voss chuckled. "And what do you think will happen? The world moves on. Protests fade. Leaders are replaced. And people like me? We always survive." But Mark wasn't listening. He focused on something behind Voss. A small red light on the wall. "Aiding camera." Live streaming everything. Voss followed his gaze, his smirk disappearing. "What did you do?" Dante grinned, despite the gun pointed at him. "We just made sure the world is watching." Within minutes, the live feed spread online. Millions were watching as Voss and his men were exposed. His arrogance had led him into the light, and there was no escaping now. The authorities had no choice. With the world's eyes on them, they had to act. Voss and his associates were arrested. But as they were taken away, he whispered one last warning to Mark. "This isn't over." And Mark knew he was right. Ethan resurfaced days later. He had escaped the chase, but he couldn't stay. "I have to disappear," he told Mark. "They'll keep coming after us." Mark nodded. "But I'm staying." Ethan sighed. "You're going to keep digging, aren't you?" Mark smirked. "Someone has to." As Ethan vanished into the shadows, Mark turned back to his laptop. A new message had arrived. Another encrypted file. More secrets. More lies. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights the complex dynamics of law enforcement, protest rights, and the consequences of excessive force. Our goal is to raise awareness, provoke discussion, and inspire accountability in the pursuit of justice.